So hello again. As I said, my name is Katrin Vorkamp. I'm professor in environmental chemistry at Aarhus University in Denmark. And I'm also co-chair of the expert group under AMAP on persistent organic pollutants and chemicals of emerging Arctic concern. It is my pleasure today to open a series of webinars to present results of our recent or nearly completed assessment of local sources versus long-range transport of organic contaminants. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge my collaborators on this work, my co-leads Derek Meyer, Cindy DeWitt, Roland Kallenborn, and Matt McLeod, and the expert group, and also all the other contributors to this work. I would also like to acknowledge my funding agency, the Danish Environmental Protection Agency. We have known since AMAP's first assessment in 1998 that persistent organic pollutants are transported to the Arctic from emission sources at lower latitudes. In the figure to the left here, you can see the use of the industrial chemicals PCBs, that's polychlorinated biphenyls, in the Northern Hemisphere. As expected, the majority of these industrial chemicals, the majority of PCBs, were used in the industrial countries in Europe, North America, and in Japan, until these countries introduced the first bans of PCBs in the 1970s and 1980s. Once emitted from these sources, PCBs and other persistent organic pollutants were transported to the Arctic, as shown in the figure to the right. These first POPs were all semi-volatile compounds that could be transported in a series of volatilization and deposition steps that we also call the grasshopper effect. Then eventually they were trapped in the Arctic. So in the Arctic, these chemicals could enter food webs. PCBs and other persistent organic pollutants biomagnify in food webs, which means that their concentration increases with each trophic level of the food chain. So animals on top of the food chain, such as certain birds and marine mammals, have the highest concentrations of these POPs. Typically, that is the polar bear in the Arctic, just not included in this figure here to the left. These birds and marine mammals are also part of the traditional Arctic diet. So when indigenous people in the Arctic and other Arctic inhabitants consume these animals, they are inevitably exposed to relatively high levels of persistent organic pollutants. This is shown in the figure to the right. It shows concentrations of a PCB 153, and para DDE, which is the stable degradation product of the insecticide DDT. So these are concentrations in the blood of Inuit, that's the blue bars, and Europeans, that's the gray bars. And in both cases, the Inuit population has significantly higher level of these POPs in their blood than the Europeans, although they are so far away from sources of PCBs and DDT. So this shows that the long-range environmental transport to the Arctic is very important. It is so important that it has become a criterion of the Stockholm Convention. The Stockholm Convention was established about 25 years ago as a global framework to regulate these POPs, recognizing that POPs indeed are a global issue. The POP criteria are listed here. So that's persistence, bioaccumulation, adverse effects, and the long-range environmental transport. If these criteria are met, a chemical can be classified as a persistent organic pollutant, and it can be regulated under the framework of the Stockholm Convention. In this assessment process, so when these screening criteria are checked, monitoring data can be included. And this means that Arctic data can have an important indicator function. So if you find contaminants in a polar bear, for example, this will indicate bioaccumulation of the compound and also long-range transport if there are no other sources. So for a long time, we have assumed that all Arctic data indicate long-range transport from lower latitudes to the Arctic. But is this assumption really always correct? This is an example of a study that we conducted in Greenland more than 20 years ago. We collected samples of shorthorn sculpin, that's the fish here in the picture, and we analyzed it for a range of different POPs and PBDEs. PBDEs were not POPs at the time of the study. PBDEs are polybrominated diphenyl ethers, and they were used as flame retardants, for example, in consumer products, in vehicles, aircrafts, and construction materials. The fish originated from 3 locations. So one location had a population of 3,200 inhabitants. Then there was one with about 40 inhabitants, and then a reference site without any human activity. We saw in this study that most of the pesticides had very similar concentrations at all locations. So if you look at toxaphene, for example, in this figure, or DDT, you see similar levels at all locations. But this was not the case for PCBs and PBDEs. So they were clearly higher at the location with most inhabitants. So this indicates that there might be emission sources from these settlements, for example, related to the use of flame retardants in consumer products. And both PCBs and PBDEs were also used in construction materials. In 2016, our expert group worked on an assessment of chemicals of emerging Arctic concern. You can see the cover of the report here in the slide. And this report also included the figure that is shown here in the middle. It shows the siloxane D5 in Arctic sediments downstream a wastewater effluent. And you can see that these concentrations, well, there are 2 graphs I should explain, but only given in different units, so it's the same data. So these concentrations decreased relatively quickly downstream this wastewater outlet and dropped below the detection limits, that's MDL here in the figure, after about 400 meters. So this might suggest that the wastewater outlet is actually the source of this siloxane in sediment, rather than the long-range environmental transport. Actually, the possibility of local sources is also mentioned for a range of other compound groups in this report, so including PFAS, that's per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, various flame retardants, phthalates used as plasticizers, chlorinated paraffins, pharmaceuticals and personal care products, and also marine plastics and microplastics, which we might not consider chemicals, strictly speaking. The most recent assessment of our expert group was about the influence of climate change on POPs and chemicals of emerging Arctic concern. In this assessment, we also discussed potential increases in human activity in the Arctic, as the Arctic becomes warmer and more accessible. We were thinking of something like increases in industry, tourism, shipping, fisheries, and so on. And these increases in human activity might also mean increases in the use of chemicals, and then perhaps more local emissions of these chemicals. However, this was still speculation at the time of the assessment, and that we felt that we needed a better basis for this kind of prediction. So this is why I put a question mark here in the middle. Also in the scientific literature, there are more and more studies that point at local sources in the Arctic. For example, this report from Svalbard and other studies related to wastewater or air emissions. So for all these reasons, we thought in our co-lead team about 3.5, 4 years ago, that it was timely to prepare an assessment on local sources versus long-range transport of contaminants. And questions that we thought were important to address are these, but they're not limited to these. For example, which local sources of POPs and chemicals of emerging Arctic concern can we identify in the Arctic? Are specific compounds mainly emitted from local sources? Can we differentiate between local sources and long-range transport in our data? Or is it actually unclear what these data represent? And then, of course, what are the implications for monitoring strategies and for chemicals management? We proposed this to the IMOP working group, and it was approved as a topic for a new assessment. But shortly after we started this assessment, the Arctic Council went on pause because of the war in Ukraine. We have then continued the assessment as a scientific project, and we are pleased now to bring it back under the AMAP umbrella. And of course, the issue of local contaminant sources in the Arctic was also known before our assessment, and it also been addressed before our assessment in an AMAP context and elsewhere. This is a map here to the left of military installations in the Arctic after the Cold War, which have often been associated with the use and emission of chemicals. And to the right here, you see some pictures of abandoned stations and other waste in the Arctic. So this has long been known as a source of pollutants, for example, PCBs, also oil and others. So we were going to consider these old and well-known sources, but also collect information on current use chemicals. So this is how we defined the scope of our assessment. We would focus on organic chemicals as opposed to metals. Of course, there are also local emissions of metals, for example, associated with mining, but this is outside the expertise and the mandate of our expert group. And the same is the case with human data, so we have only focused on environmental data. We approached the topic with a series of review articles based on existing literature and combined these with some case studies, including new data. And finally, we also considered climate change related effects on emission sources. As our assessment has been a scientific project instead of a classical AMAP assessment report, we have published the results in a special issue of this journal, Environmental Science Advances. And these are the topics of the review papers. Most of them have been published now. And I should say that I have the full references to all these papers at the end of my presentation and some additional slides where they will be available in the recording. We have included an updated review on long-range environmental transport and contrast to local sources. We also have an extensive review on infrastructure as a potential source of chemical emissions, such as waste handling, airports, the military installations I mentioned before, energy supply, and so on. We have 2 articles on wastewater, one general overview, and one related to emissions of chemicals. One article deals with future developments related to climate change. For example, an increase in secondary sources. As the ice melts, the permafrost thaws and chemicals are released. And also the increase in human activity that I mentioned before. The review of regulatory frameworks will be presented by Emily in this webinar after my presentation. And then finally, we will synthesize key findings, draw conclusions, and come up with some recommendations for next steps. This is the list of the case studies that have been published so far. So we have one case study on dioxins in the Arctic, and then 2 case studies from Iceland, one on a military station and one on wildfires, and then a case study on wet wipes in wastewater, so actually related to litter pollution. And in this last article here, do Arctic local sources of pollution influence the exposure of ring seals? In this case study, we calculated for ring seals from the Northern Contaminants Program in Canada if their exposure could be influenced by local sources. I've made the connection to the Stockholm Convention and the importance of the long-range transport criterion for the classification of PUPs. As I showed in the beginning, we know that humans in the Arctic can be strongly exposed to PUPs, for example, from food chain accumulation. But of course, local sources can also contribute to human exposure. This is an example here in the picture of waste burning at a community in Nunavik, but there can be many other examples. This is just the random one I have picked. Waste burning can lead to emissions to air that then can cause human exposure directly through inhalation. There can also be a deposition of contaminants to water, and then, as I described in the beginning, an uptake in food webs and accumulation in food webs and human exposure through food. There can also be a risk of drinking water contamination of those compounds that might be less bioaccumulative. So human exposure can happen through inhalation and ingestion following local emissions. We have currently planned 5 more webinars on the topic of our assessment, often combining one of the larger review articles with one of the case studies or other contributions from younger researchers. So these upcoming webinars are scheduled every other week now until early November, and always in the same time slot as today. So I hope that this introduction has caught your interest and that you will also join in the future. As I said, the full references are available in the remaining slides, so you can find them in the recorded version. I will not show them now. So I will hand over to Emily now, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Hi everyone, my name is Emily Cowan. I am a research scientist at Sintef Ocean in Trondheim, Norway, and I have the lovely opportunity to share with you all today a review I undertook with a group of experts on multi-level governance of chemicals of emerging Arctic concern. So a very brief outline of what you're going to get in this presentation today. I'm going to talk about what are chemicals of emerging Arctic concern, why do they matter, the approach we took to undertake this first of its kind review of governance, and then we'll lay out the governance landscape of these chemicals of emerging Arctic concern, what they may cover, I'll then discuss key gaps that we currently have in our regulations in place, followed by sort of recommendations or conclusions for the future. So where Katrin showed us very well where these chemicals are coming from, all of the research that has gone into this, my focus in the presentation today is a bit different, and it's on what are we going to do about it. So we're focusing on what sort of governance mechanisms exist, what's missing, and how can we strengthen these responses. So without further ado, I will get into it in terms of understanding chemicals of emerging Arctic concern. So we have what are these chemicals of emerging Arctic concern? They're chemicals that are not fully regulated yet, but have been detected in the Arctic environment. And we may know from the early 90s, AMAP has been really at the forefront of documenting all of these contaminants in the Arctic, having early assessments, showing high levels of these persistent organic pollutants, leading to direct action from the Stockholm Convention. But as Katrin mentioned, their team went a bit further in this 2016 assessment to identify what are the new and upcoming major groups of chemicals of emerging Arctic concern. And that's where this review leads us here. So there's a group of 16 and counting of these emerging chemicals. And they have with them regulatory challenges in the fact that many of these chemicals fall outside of the existing regulatory frameworks we have in place currently. And we can think that our chemical production, it far outpaces the regulatory assessments that we have to keep up with them. There's approximately 350,000 chemicals that are registered for use globally, where we have very less than that are actually regulated in practice. And as well as mentioned in the previous presentation, these transport mechanisms for these chemicals, it may be long range, but also local sources, which was important for us to keep in mind in this review. And of course, the overarching sort of assessment and framework here is that climate change is accelerating the releases of these pollutants in the Arctic and finding new pathways for creating new pathways for contamination. But let's get into it. Why does governance matter here? Why are we looking at this in this sort of AMAP-esque assessment? Is that chemicals of emerging Arctic concern, they fall outside of the treaties. And we found through our research that if there is a risk assessment going towards a regulation, that they rarely take into account Arctic specific considerations or vulnerabilities. And what's at stake here is human health, One Health, making sure we integrate Indigenous rights at the core of our regulations. And overarching to all of this as well is, of course, the transboundary nature of these chemicals, which make it impossible for us to regulate just at the regional level or just at the national level alone to fully address the whole breadth of chemicals of emerging Arctic concern. Now, this is not just a theory about the transboundary nature of chemicals. I've seen this at play in the plastic treaty negotiations. That's actually what my background is in. I have a PhD in political science following the treaty negotiations from its inception until now. And I see a lot of similarities with just the plastic negotiations and these chemicals of emerging Arctic concern. So this is a photo taken a few weeks ago at the second session of the plastic treaty negotiations. And here in the photo, we can see different country negotiators in a huddle in the negotiating room where they suddenly had to break from negotiations. I think this wasn't even on a contentious topic such as production of plastics or its associated chemicals. This was on waste management, which was a more agreed upon topic. But it really goes to show that in these global negotiations, countries, of course, bring different positions to the table. They're shaped by national interest, their own economic dependencies, as well as how their industries are structured. Do they have a big plastic producing industry or chemicals in that case? And this is really showing why it takes so many years for agreements to be reached. It's not because our science is unclear, but it's all of the intertwining of politics, economics, trade implications, and national interest. So if we think about it when it comes to chemicals of emerging Arctic concern, or plastics in this case, if we were to achieve a ban or restriction, there may be other challenges that come with this. So if we were to phase out a chemical, we need to think about how we make sure that it's not being replaced by another chemical that's maybe just as much persistent or even more harmful. And that's why it's really important to take a holistic, precautionary governance approach to help us look forward and think of future governance and not just sort of playing whack-a-mole with chemical regulation. So let's go into our review approach that we took for this study that was so kindly introduced by Katrin. This, on the governance side, was a sort of first of its kind review trying to systematically map how governance we have in place now relates or could relate to chemicals of emerging Arctic concern. So while we have a vast amount of literature from the natural science aspects monitoring on trying to better understand chemicals of emerging Arctic concern, where they're coming from, we found that very little is written about governance. So our scope of this review was to try to understand what we have in place globally, regionally, nationally, in some places locally to govern these chemicals of emerging Arctic concern. Our methods, we use sort of policy review, reviewing treaty processes, referencing back with the monitoring data that we're getting from our colleagues, as well as coupling this with interviews when needed with policymakers. And as I mentioned, its purpose is really this first initial step review to see what do we have in place, what's missing. It's not a deep dive review, not expert advice into every single policy, but laying the framework for future research to dive into sort of what gaps may remain and how we can build on them. So without further ado, I'll now get into what we did in our study, going from what regulations are in place at the global level, regionally, nationally. So at the global level, this was presented as well in the first presentation. We have sort of a patchwork quilt of important pieces, but they don't necessarily all fully are able to cover chemicals of emerging Arctic concern. But of course, on top, we have the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. This still remains one of the most influential frameworks that we have. And as was mentioned, it defines these persistent organic pollutants using 4 criteria. And the Arctic monitoring data has been really strong in making sure we get these persistent organic pollutants on the list. It started with 12 chemicals known as the Dirty Dozen. Now the convention has over 34 listed as of 2024. But it also has its drawbacks. It's a slow process. It takes at least 3 years to nominate just one chemical. States have the ability to opt in or opt out. There's exemptions. They don't have to sign up for all of them. And it, of course, includes other types of chemicals of emerging Arctic concern, as this is only focused on persistent organic pollutants and not all chemicals. We next have the Basel Convention, which may come to mind. I'm sure a lot of people in this webinar already know about these, so I'll go through them briefly, but it controls the transboundary movement of hazardous waste. It's also expanded in recent years to include some measures on plastic waste as well as e-waste, but it in fact just regulates waste and not products per se. So chemicals of emerging Arctic concern can still remain outside of the scope of this convention. We then have the Rotterdam Convention, which requires exporting countries to notify and obtain consent before shipping a hazardous chemical. Again, this has to be listed. It takes time. It takes a certain amount of countries to agree to restrict. And the process is slow here as well. We also have IMOs, the International Maritime Organization, where we find MARPOL and the London Convention, more recently the Polar Code, which regulates pollution from ships. And a good example we find under the IMO agreement here is the recent agreements to phase out PFAS from firefighting foams on ships by next year, allegedly. But this is really showing that how regulations can keep up with our existing and emerging science. And we're able to amend these agreements. And then we have the Global Framework on Chemicals from the United Nations Environmental Program. You might know it previously as CEACs. This is less legally binding. This is more of a voluntary basis, multi-stakeholder platform, a way to set targets, come up with strategies on how we're going to phase out hazardous substance. But again, it's not legally binding, it's voluntary based. And all of these together at the global level still show us that there's not one overarching global chemicals agreement to regulate chemicals of emerging Arctic concern. Moving on to the regional governance mechanisms for chemicals of emerging Arctic concern. I know this is a webinar based on the AMAP, so I'm not going to go too into detail here, but of course the Arctic Council is the key player and political forum for regional cooperation here in the Arctic. But as I'm sure you all are aware, it's more consensus-based, soft law, and it really depends on member states' willingness to cooperate. But we've seen very strong results from AMAP playing this central role in the scientific assessments. The same can be said from the OSPAR Convention, of course, not just Arctic specific. It covers parts of the Arctic and its monitoring program. We thought for our review as well, we could include the Convention on Long-Range Transport of Air Pollution as maybe a future potential to look in how it addresses air pollutants with a persistent organic pollutant protocol within it. Moving on a little bit at the supranational level, we have the EU's chemical regulation in REACH. So registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals. And this is the EU's overarching chemical management system. So how it works in practice is companies must register chemicals with data on sort of hazards and uses. And then it goes to the European Chemicals Agency and member states to check the data and the quality of these risks. So at the EU, it puts the burden on the industry to make sure this data is done. And it could go through phases where it may require restrictions or ban or limited use of a chemical if needed. But again, similar to the global level, what we find here is that evaluation and restrictions take a long time. It could be up to a decade or longer. And what our research has found is that we can have industry maybe submit incomplete reports to the committee, or it could be have some sort of poor quality data, which leads the process to take even longer. But there is positive effects. Member states can go beyond this and implement their own restrictions, as seen in Denmark. And we can start thinking of ways of how to close these loopholes. Maybe we can shift the burden further on industry, making sure that these chemicals are proven safe before they're able to be marketed and sold. Things to think about in the future. Now, the last level of governance we're going to go over today, which was in our review, is the national regulatory approaches for Arctic states. So we start here with the United States and their Toxic Substance Control Act, first from the late 70s. It's been recently updated in 2016. And in the US, for restricting a chemical, it requires 3 steps. So the first one, prioritization, it's really deciding whether a chemical is of high or low concern. It then moves into risk evaluation, looking at more hazard and exposure, followed by risk management. But things to note for the US chemicals regulation is that it excludes categories, including chemicals of emerging Arctic concern, like pesticides, food additives, and pharmaceuticals. So it's not overarching of all of these chemicals of concern. We then had experts look into the Canadian side of national regulatory approaches via the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. This is the main chemicals law in Canada, and it's more of a risk-based approach, and it applies the precautionary principle. The catch is on this approach is that sufficient data must be available before action is taken. And our experts found that progress is slow moving under this plan as well. It took nearly 20 years to evaluate around 4,000 high priority substance. So this often, again, highlights how regulation and governance can lag behind chemical innovation and production. And finally, our other Arctic states we briefly looked at was the Russian Federation. From the available information online, we found that in 2021, there was the adoption of a technical regulation on the safety of chemical products, requiring registration, labeling. However, there is not so much information on how this law is being implemented in practice from our side. And then, yes, again, overarching few national regulations and chemicals management specifically consider Arctic vulnerabilities within their risk assessments. So I want to make sure you're all still awake and still with me. This was pretty heavy going into the different levels of governance, especially if you're not a political science nerd like myself. So I like to break it up with pictures. And after we examined these multiple levels of governance that may concern or affect chemicals of emerging Arctic concern, on paper, it may seem like we have a lot of them, they're comprehensive, but when we put all of these governance slices in place, we see that it's kind of like Swiss cheese where chemicals can fall through the cracks. So at the global level, we have the Stockholm Convention, which has been very effective at limiting, restricting some persistent organic pollutants. It doesn't cover all. And in similar, we see global and national frameworks, which are varying enormously in what they can cover. So when we stack up all these slices together, we're not just getting one seamless governance shield to protect the environment, human health. It's really full of gaps and blind spots that we need to work on filling, and that's what our review stresses and lays the groundwork for future governance studies to try to help figure out how we can make this better. So what are some of the key governance gaps that we assessed that I want to leave you with today? That is fragmentation. There's no overarching global chemicals treaty to rule them all. They're fragmented across multiple agencies and levels of governance. There's an Arctic blindness when it comes to how regulations consider Arctic's unique vulnerabilities or indigenous peoples' knowledge or needs. And these risk assessments vary per country and per region. And of course, how it is in multilateral environmental negotiations, there is a slow response and a lag when it comes to how quickly chemicals are being innovated, produced, put on the market, and how long it takes to review and make sure that these are not harmful and of concern. So local challenges and indigenous perspectives that we found throughout our studies. Of course, as we all know here, the Arctic has its unique challenges, being so remote, having limited infrastructure, that's including inadequate waste and water treatment infrastructure that could allow some of these local sources to slip through. There's another webinar coming up in the future where they're going to be discussing this topic specifically. And all of this coupled with the multiple stressors we're facing of climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss, and socioeconomic pressures. When it comes to Indigenous knowledge and governance, the Arctic Indigenous people, they are represented in the Arctic Council through permanent participants. But what we find at the global level in these global legally binding treaties is their knowledge and views are often marginalized in these chemical regulation processes. So we really need to focus on how we can better co-produce this knowledge and integrate these perspectives. Now, I want to talk about recommendations for how we can improve this governance. So the first one would be to take a holistic approach. So integrate governance framework, an integrated governance framework, and really taking a life cycle approach when it comes to chemicals management. So when we look at these chemicals of emerging Arctic concern and have risk assessments, they're very valuable tools, but our current risk assessments are very limited in what they actually assess. They rarely assess the mixture of these chemicals, the cocktails they can create. They rarely assess cultural or maybe even economic differences in place. And what we want to get through with this review is that there is a very big lack of peer-reviewed literature or studies on the regulatory side of this and chemicals of emerging Arctic concern, including how do we best design, develop, and improve and make sure that our agreements in place are effective. Another recommendation is using the precautionary principle as a guiding light. So this principle should be applied when we have enough evidence of potential harm, as we've seen from the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And strengthening this precaution in the Arctic context really means that we as policymakers, as researchers, we should not wait for decades of monitoring data before we decide to act. If we see from the research coming out, that is from our group of esteemed colleagues, if we have substances that are showing persistence, accumulation in Arctic food webs, we should take precautionary measures from the start in terms of looking into substitutions, thinking about tighter import controls, and this should all be done early on, not as a afterthought. Indigenous inclusion is very important for improved governance of chemicals of emerging Arctic concern because Indigenous peoples are among the most affected by these chemicals due to their close links with health, food security, and the environment. And policymakers really need to ensure meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples in decision-making processes, not just consultation, but this co-production of knowledge and shared authority. And finally, enhancing monitoring and data sharing. I think it goes without saying that we know monitoring is the backbone of Arctic chemicals governance. Without this data, these chemicals of emerging Arctic concern are remaining invisible also in the global processes we have for governance. So we need to expand these networks, expand funding for laboratories, training, and investing in ways to better share data so we can make evidence-based decisions when it comes to chemicals governance. And finally, as I know there are many members of AMAP or the Arctic Council in attendance here today, I want to make sure that I don't leave you here with a doom and gloom feeling. And I want you to feel empowered, know that you're in a position to make a difference, make governance more effective that works for chemicals of emerging Arctic concern. And you can do this in your own space by supporting and expanding monitoring, including Indigenous peoples and knowledge in your consultations, decision-making, so we can really prevent our emerging chemicals that we see today from becoming the future's legacy pollutants. So that's all I have for me. This is our article if you want more information or to read up on it. And my esteemed co-authors are also on the list. I think some of them are in this meeting today if there's further questions. But yes, that's all for me. Thank you.